Hello. Microphone troubles here. Today we're going to be covering graphing with ARM. Slightly different format than our previous webinars, trying to squeeze everything into a half hour instead of the full hour. So trying to condense things down a little bit. So I've already started a recording. We'll send out that recording later on through the LMS or YouTube. And let's dive in. Feel free, though, as we go through today's session, if you have any questions, I'll try to keep one eye on the chat, or if we have time at the end, we can also hang out for a little bit as well. So graphing in ARM, I've got a trial for us today that just has a couple of data columns. A realistic trial would probably have a lot more, but just need a couple to show some of the graphing functionality that ARM offers. And we'll really be generating graphs of our assessment data columns. And so to start that process, I'm just going to click into a column that I want to graph. And we have the menu at the top to generate a new graph. Couple of questions for us. We can choose treatment numbers to include on the graph. We don't have to include all of them. You can click on the screen to select them, or you can type down below, and you'll see that selection updates. The nice thing here too is you can control the order of the treatments. So if you don't necessarily want them in the order that you wrote them, but instead a different order on the graph, this is your opportunity to do that. So here I've chosen one last, so our untreated should be all the way on the right for our graph. Moving to the next step, ARM will ask us which column to graph. It is possible to graph more than one column at a time. We'll stick with the simple, just one column for now. If we get time, we can come back and show the multi-column graph, but most commonly you're trying to graph a single assessment. And then finally, we have a choice for assessment header fields for the labels on the report. And we'll actually see this selection again. By default, it gave me my pest code. I could certainly change that, but I'm just going to leave the default. We'll see where that affects the graph in a moment, and then also how we can come back and change the selection if there's a different piece of information from our description of the assessment that we want to have as our label on the graph. So when I click OK, I then have my graph options, and we'll spend most of our time today here. I'm just going to choose to do a bar graph, and we'll come back to talk about all of these other options. But when I click OK, then ARM will generate a graph for us. And as you can see, the order of my treatments matched the selection that I made. And I have my legend on the right. So this is the main graph window for us. Primarily, what we'll end up doing once you get that graph to start with, there is an options button down here at the bottom, and that will open this as a separate window. And this is kind of handy because the main graph is still visible to us. So if I move my options over to the right, I can make changes to my graph. Maybe I'll change from a bar to a line graph. And if I press the Apply Now button, instead of closing this window, it just updates that graph picture behind here. So it's a nice way, especially if you aren't exactly sure or want to fiddle a little bit with your options and see exactly what they might do. It's a great way to turn things on and off. So or maybe it's the orientation. Well, how would this look better as a horizontal graph? Yes, maybe not. Maybe I'll go back to vertical. So you can change the options, and that's kind of how we'll go through the rest of these options here so we can see pretty quickly the difference in what some of these options do. Looking at this general page that we have, of course, we've got the graph type. So there's really three different types of graphs ARM can generate for us: the bar graph, a line graph, and a box whisker. If you do have more than one data column, we'll come back to that group by. In this case, we've only got the one data column, so we really only would want to group by treatments. Then depending on your graph type, some of these options are a little bit different. We saw when I had the line graph, you'll see a refresh as in it's options related to how thick is the line, things like that. Whereas for the bar graph, it's how are the bars going to be displayed. So I could do like a stacked and see how that looks. Oh, well, I've only got one data series, so that's not going to do me a lot of good. So we'll keep it back with the simple here. And then there's also a option here for display data. So that's these little dots. They're actually red dots here that show the individual data points, depending on if you have subsamples or not. I don't think I have any subsamples in this study, but you can turn those dots off entirely if you prefer. And this option is also kind of on that main window of the graph here in the lower left corner. So a couple of the most common ones, most impactful, we do also have out on that main window, but it's the exact same option tied here in the graph options. All right, going through these other tabs in our options to see what we can do. Fonts, really just a matter of changing the text font and styling. You can bold or put things in italics, things like that. The idea here, just choose the component that you want to change, and then you can make the adjustment to the font size or style, and it'll update that on the graph. Moving on to labels. These labels here are for our treatments, and the text that was pre-filled here came from my trial map for this trial. So when you open up the trial map, there's a tab at the bottom for treatment description, and that is the same text that is used here. And it gets built when you first create a trial, and you can, of course, choose the different fields. In this case, you can see it's kind of concatenated my product name, my treatment name, and the rate and rate unit. And for treatment number 4, I actually had 2 different components. So it's got the treatment name and rate for the first component, and then separates it with a semicolon, and then has the information for the second one. If I want to simplify this, I sure can. If it's getting a little long or whatever, I can certainly do that. When I change that, it will ask me if I also want to update that information in the trial map. Since that's where it came from, they can continue to remain the same, or if this is really only kind of a shorthand for my graph, I can say no, and then that trial map description will stay the same. So maybe this was an effort to just kind of simplify the graph here. A couple other options that we can turn on or off. The data labels is the mean that shows up there. So if we turn those off, that can take away that mean value if you don't want it on there. The x-axis labels as legend. If I turn that off, you'll see kind of by default, when that's off, we put that whole description for each treatment down below. And right now that actually looks pretty good. Kind of depends on how long of a description you end up with. So if I'm going to regenerate that back to being pretty long and see if there we go. Sometimes you end up with a little less nice of a setup. So if you have a long treatment description, you really, it really kind of makes a mess, uses up a lot of space on that graph. So that's really why this x-axis labels as legend can be pretty nice, just to get all that information over to the side, so that way we have more room for the graph itself. So that's a recommended one to turn on if you've got longer treatment descriptions. And then finally, we do have the AOV mean separation letters from the report on the graph, but those can be turned off as well. And so that actually does run the statistics based on whatever options you currently have in your report options. So this pop-up you can use to change those if you needed, but it'll be the exact same letters that you would see on the AOV report if you generated it right this moment. All right. A few of these other tabs, the legend. In our case, we really just used the treatment. Let me go back actually and turn those off just to show if we aren't using the x-axis as a legend, then we really don't have a legend here. If you had multiple columns involved, then we would need a legend for that. But you can also change the color of the treatments. So if I want to change the color of the bar, that is in this table here. So if I click into 3 here, treatment 3, and I want to change from yellow to maybe this darker red, it's just a matter of clicking into that row and adjusting the color down below. And there's even different patterns or things if you want to get fancy with it. The titles is really just where all of this text is coming from for the graph. So this comes from your header, but you could change it. You may or may not want anything in the bottom title. So if you clear that out, that'll just take that entire component off of there if there's no text in any of these items. The labels here for the left title to label your axis, you can choose which fields to include. So that was that selection earlier. We can get back to this. And right now I've got my rating type and unit to describe the assessment itself. So maybe that's pretty logical. But I could change whatever information I would want to pull in from the column itself. There, it actually changed the order around. Can get filled in. And I could turn off that right title if I didn't want it at all. Axis options just control, how the graph is being built. The y-axis and the x-axis. If you want label, how the y-axis would be labeled. The grid marks themselves, if you don't want them. I think for a bar graph, you just about need them. Probably the most impactful one on this tab would be the y-axis scale. So that controls the scale for which the data is on. And so if you wanted to adjust kind of manually, so by default, I've got this 0 origin. So we'll make sure that 0 is always the very first one, but then ARM just kind of determines based on the data, what's a reasonable spot to stop at. But if you did want to override that, you sure can. So maybe if this was percentage data and it was more impactful for me to show, oops, I did that backwards, maximum of 100 and minimum of 0. That was maybe more impactful to show the true scale of what happened because it was percent or whatever. You can override by turning on the user defined. The nice thing about 0 origin, if I turn that one on, is that it automatically adjusts. So if I say okay to my graph options, maybe I'll do the x-axis as legend. So I've got 0 to 50. When I'm on this graph, there is a next column and previous column, so we can move to the next assessment or a previous assessment pretty quickly, and it'll generate a new graph for each of those columns. So here I moved to column number 3, and because I had the zero origin, and ARM has automatically adjusted to max out at 35 instead, based on the data. Oops, I was thinking about the data labels, but that's fine. So that's nice. Coming back here to the axis, having zero origin ARM will always change the axis based on the data. Whereas if you've user defined, then every time you switch columns, it's always that same scale. So once more, that was on the axis tab, your y-axis scale. That zero origins, just a little more dynamic. Colors is kind of similar to the fonts in that you first choose the component that you're looking at. So maybe I'm looking at the graph title, and I say, you know, that blue and black isn't quite what I want, so I'll choose that item. And then for some of these, there's a foreground and a background. The foreground would be the text that's kind of in front, if you will. And then the background is that, in this case, that lighter blue background to it. So maybe I really don't want that border at all. I could make the background white, and then I could also take off that drop shadow. And then that really makes it look as if there's no box whatsoever. And maybe I'm happy with the black, or maybe I want a splash of color. Maybe I choose a blue or something, or whatever you'd like. And so that goes for just about any component here of the graph, except for the bars themselves. Remember, the bars we changed on the Legends tab. But everything else you can change the color of on the Colors tab. And then finally, there are error bars. And right now I do have error bars for each of these treatments, and it's running the standard error, but you could also use the standard deviation, 1 or 2 standard deviations, whatever you may want, percent value, fixed value, or you can turn them off. Yes, the arranging treatments in a different order. So that's actually what I had here. You'll notice 2, 3, 4, 1. That I controlled when I selected my treatments. So when I first generated the graph, I chose the order of the treatments. And if I wanted to get there again, if I wanted to change that, there is a button here in the graph options to reselect data. And ARM will ask me those questions again. So this was the first question asked when we did new graph, and we can choose that again. So here I chose 2 through 4, and then number 1 to have it on the end. And again, our assessment column numbers, there's that labeling that we chose, rating type and rating unit. And so we didn't change our data, so it looks the same. All right, so that's really all of the graph options, different ways to control the way your graph looks. Kind of the next step, or really the final step in using this graph, would be to save it. And there are a few different ways to save the graph depending on what you want to achieve. And so there's a bunch of different save functions that each do something a little bit different. So from the graph dialog, there is a button to save. Oops. And what this is trying to do is it's going to save a grf8 file. And really that is going to save the graph file associated with this particular trial. So personally, I haven't used this a whole lot, but it's ARM's way to remember both this trial and the graph options that we've chose, kind of all bundled into one thing. Really just to, oh, I have to go, but I want to resume from this trial this exact same way again. That's how I can save this grf8 file. And the name, you can see it used, this is the trial name, my trial ID of this study. So it's really specific to this one trial. So I don't know how useful that might be compared to the save as. And this gives us some image formats that we can generate to save this graph as a picture file. So I've got JPEG, I've got PNG, bitmap, all the different image file types that I would like to generate. And then I can send that to a file. And I could choose whatever folder I would want. I could drop it on my desktop or wherever in my pictures. Again, that's saving an image of this graph, almost as if I took a picture, a screenshot or something of what I see on the screen. One more option for saving on this graph options, we can also save a set. So that's a lot like a report set, if you've done reporting, where we're going to encapsulate all of the options we've configured and all of these sections, put them all into a file. So that way I can use that same list of options again and again. So it's not actually saving this graph image, it's just remembering all of these selections I made in the graph dialog. So that way I can create consistent graphs in all of my different trials. Or maybe send that graph file set to a colleague so they can create a graph that looks just like mine, etc. So you would save a set onto your computer, and then if you came back later or your colleague generated a graph, then they would load that set to put all those options just the way they were. So there's a bunch of different ways to save. My favorite is the clipboard button. So that's down here at the bottom, the word clipboard, or there's also a shortcut up in this corner, this little copy symbol with the two sheets of paper. And what that does is it basically more or less takes a screenshot of the graph the way it is right here and puts it on my clipboard so I can paste into PowerPoint, I could paste into an email, into my Word document, kind of whatever else I might be creating that I want to use that graph in. I probably should have not used my keyboard here, something a little more visual. If I paste that image, you'll notice there's no components to it. I can't change it anymore. It's all flat. It's just a picture that about all I can do is resize. That's the quickest, easiest way. Like I said, if you're creating a presentation or something, being able to do that. Again, that was the clipboard button. There was a question about individual data points are not shown on my graph. So that's tied to this display data option. So right now I have it set to none, but I can show the plot values. And that puts those little red dots on each of those to see the individual data points. And then the other question, which we do have a minute for, is if two different parameters can be in the same graph. So you can have more than one assessment column in a graph. Maybe I'll close this one. We showed the reselect data, and so I could have done that. But if I just start over again with a new graph, And maybe I'll use all of the treatments in their regular order this time. When I select columns, I can choose more than one. And so that's how you would do, two different parameters, or it could be the same assessment at multiple rating times, something like that. When I have more than one selected, ARM is going to ask, are we creating one graph with multiple columns in there? Or am I wanting to create a graph of one data column at a time, and I've just chosen the different columns that I want to graph one by one? And that'll kind of loop into that next column, previous column button. So I'm going to say, yes, I want one graph with 2 columns of data in there. And in this case, I have the same assessment type on 2 different dates. So my label, I think I'm going to hide. I don't want the rating type and rating unit because that's the same, but really it's the rating date that separates the 2 of them. So now my graph has 2 different data points. If I turn off that x-axis, you'll see my legend here now has the 2 different columns. So again, that's how you could do 2 different parameters, or in my case, 2 different dates of the same parameter, either way. And you still have all of these different options. I could do a line graph. That's kind of handy for like a repeated measures type of thing. If you do the line graph and then change the grouping, right now it's by treatments, so that line really doesn't make any sense. But if I group by data column, then that switches so that the treatments are what we have here on the legend, and then the dates I have selected are on the axis. So now if I had, obviously I've only got 2 dates, so there's not a lot of time series to it, but if I had a 3rd and a 4th date, then that line graph really creates a nice story about what happened throughout time for this assessment that was performed again and again. The bar graph has that same option to group by data columns instead. So that would show, the performance of each treatment at the different dates. So just kind of switching what's your variables here for the graph by treatments or by column. I think that's how you can utilize the stacked as well if that made more sense. In this case, it really doesn't. It's not cumulative, but all right, great questions. We've made it through each section of the graph options and also how to do multiple graphs. So I think we made it. Any other questions on graphing? Feel free if you're using the graph function, something doesn't quite work right, trying to remember where something is. There's always on that options, whatever options section that you're on, there is a help button. So if you're not totally sure what it does or can't quite get it to work, and that is showing on my other screen. There we go. So for all of those different options, there is a write-up. So for each option you see on the screen, it'll give you a rundown of what each of those options choices would do. There's a nice time series example for us of the line graph there to give an idea of what those different items would do for you. We do have a dose response curve that is not in this standard graphing tool. Instead, if I close the graph here, the dose response is actually in the print reports. So in the available reports, under the summary, there's a dose response analysis. So that will run that analysis. There are several graphs, a main graph in that report itself when you generate that, and you can choose your estimation method and your analysis type in the report options there. Great question, but that is in the report, as there's kind of a little wizard that'll come up so you can choose what treatment or chemical you want to track for the dose. All right, well, thanks everybody. We've got our time. Oh, I got another question. Feel free if you have to go. I appreciate your attendance. Since it's a half hour, I can hang out for some questions too. The question I had here was using ARM to assess the same value across multiple timings. So couple of options there, kind of like in this case where I had my stand count on the same weed, just at 2 different timings. You can run the repeated measures analysis. So that's also in your print reports. Under summary, there is a repeated measures. And so that basically treats those different timings as factor levels, and it creates a split plot in just kind of in the analysis realm, treats it like it's a split plot design, and then you can investigate the interaction of time with that response that you get for those treatments. And so you can generate a report that way. And there's just a wizard to have you select the repeated assessment. So it'll have all of the columns. We won't get very much here. I'll just real quick generate it. Not very many columns, but it'll ask us to click on a column, and then it'll predict to say, all right, well, you're doing the stand count on the AMAPA. So it'll grab 1 and 3, and then it'll run the analysis. And in this case, it's not going to be very exciting. We'll use just the rating date real quick. But that's how you would assess, and you can really dig in a little bit to how time played a role in your repeated assessment. And that too, I believe, generates a graph for us. In addition to these statistics, there will be a graph on that report too, which looks just like that line graph that we made. Great questions. We kind of found the other 2 spots in ARM where there are graphs, not quite all of the options in there because they're kind of hard-coded, if you will, into the report, but definitely fits in this theme as well. So thanks, everybody, and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.